The late autumn wind swept across the open prairie, carrying dust, dry grass, and the scent of distant rain. A lone wagon creaked along the narrow trail leading toward the forgotten settlement of Blackbriar Crossing. Its wooden wheels groaned with every turn, yet the young woman guiding the mule never once complained. She tightened the worn leather reins and kept her eyes fixed on the fading road ahead. Her name was Clara Whitmore, 23 years old, and everything she owned fit inside the weathered wagon behind her. A cast-iron kettle, 2 blankets carefully stitched by her late grandmother, a small wooden chest containing journals, and a faded canvas satchel filled with dried herbs and handwritten household records. They weren't recipes. They were observations, notes on preserving food, repairing tools, storing grain, predicting storms, and surviving seasons when the frontier offered no second chances. It was the spring of 1817, and the frontier had little patience for people traveling alone, especially women. As the sun dipped lower, Clara noticed movement near a shallow creek. 3 horses stood without riders. 1 saddle lay in the mud. She slowed the mule. A deep voice echoed from behind a cottonwood tree. "Don't come another step." The barrel of an old flintlock rifle appeared first. Then its owner. The man looked to be in his early 40s, broad-shouldered, with a thick beard streaked by early gray. His coat carried years of dust rather than decoration. Clara didn't reach for the small hunting knife hidden beneath the wagon seat. Instead, she raised both hands calmly. "I'm only looking for water." The stranger studied her for several long seconds. "Traveling alone? Seems that way. You ain't scared?" "I've learned fear wastes daylight." For the first time, the man's stern face softened ever so slightly. "My name's Gideon Mercer." "Clara Whitmore." He lowered the rifle. "Then you've picked a poor road." Clara glanced toward the abandoned saddles. "What happened?" "River thieves." She looked back at him. "You fought them?" "They lost interest once they realized I had nothing worth stealing." His answer sounded honest. So did the exhaustion behind it. Only then did Clara notice the dark stain spreading beneath his left sleeve. "You're bleeding." "It'll wait." "No." Before Gideon could object, she climbed down from the wagon and opened the small wooden chest. She removed a clean strip of linen, boiled water from a small kettle, and crushed dried yarrow leaves between smooth stones. "You a doctor?" he asked. "No." "Then how do you know what you're doing?" "My grandmother survived 40 years on the frontier." She smiled faintly. "I paid attention." Within minutes she had cleaned the wound, wrapped the arm securely, and fashioned a simple sling. Gideon flexed his fingers. "The bleeding stopped. It will start again if you keep pretending you're younger than you are." A quiet laugh escaped him. It sounded like someone who hadn't laughed in months. As twilight settled over the prairie, Gideon finally spoke. "I've got a settlement about 12 miles north." "What kind?" "Small." "How small?" 30 families if everyone's home." "And they're doing well?" He hesitated. "No." That single word carried more weight than a long explanation. The next morning they traveled together. The trail climbed through rolling hills before revealing Blackbriar Crossing. From a distance it looked promising. Smoke drifted from chimneys. Children chased each other near a water trough. Fields surrounded the cabins. But Clara noticed details no one else seemed to see. The wheat leaned unevenly despite recent rain. Several fences had collapsed but remained untouched. The community well sat dangerously close to a muddy drainage ditch. Fresh firewood lay scattered directly on damp ground. Half the grain sacks outside the trading store rested against soaked walls instead of raised platforms. None of those mistakes looked serious alone. Together they whispered the same warning. Someone had stopped preparing for tomorrow. As the wagon rolled through the settlement, curious faces appeared in nearly every doorway. An elderly woman folded her arms. "Who's the girl?" "A traveler," Gideon answered. "We don't need travelers. We need workers." The woman wasn't convinced. Most weren't. A young blacksmith barely looked up from his anvil. 2 ranch hands exchanged doubtful glances. One muttered just loudly enough to be heard. "Looks like she'll be asking for supper before sunset." Clara ignored them. She had heard worse. Gideon led her toward the largest cabin near the center of town. Inside waited 6 community leaders gathered around a rough pine table. Maps covered one corner. Bills covered another. No one smiled. The oldest man removed his spectacles. "You brought help." "I brought someone willing to work." The old man looked Clara up and down. "What exactly can you do?" She didn't answer immediately. Instead, her eyes wandered across the room. A cracked flour barrel leaked onto the floor. Rain dripped steadily through a loose roof plank. Half-burned candles sat scattered across the table while daylight still poured through the windows. A pot of coffee had boiled so long it smelled bitter enough to fill the room. The ledger lying open before the council showed numbers scratched out and rewritten so many times they no longer meant anything. Finally, Clara met the old man's eyes. "I don't know yet." Confused silence followed. She continued calmly. "I've been here less than a minute. If I tell you what I can fix before I understand what's broken, I'd only be guessing." The room grew unusually quiet. Even Gideon looked surprised. Clara stepped toward the leaking flour barrel, scooped a handful between her fingers, and let it fall slowly back into the cracked container. Then she looked toward the window where dark clouds gathered over the distant hills. "If those clouds bring 3 days of rain." She paused. "This settlement won't have a food problem." Everyone watched her. "It'll have a survival problem." No one spoke. Outside, the first distant rumble of thunder rolled across the frontier, while inside the cabin, 6 skeptical faces slowly began to realize that the quiet young traveler standing before them might have seen something they had all overlooked. Another distant rumble of thunder rolled across the frontier, while inside the cabin, 6 skeptical faces slowly began to realize that the quiet young traveler standing before them might have seen something they had all overlooked. The silence lingered for several heartbeats. Rain began tapping softly against the cabin roof, each drop finding its own rhythm. Then another drop slipped through the cracked plank above the council table and landed squarely on the weathered ledger. Clara reached across the table before anyone else reacted. She lifted the book away from the dripping water and set it beside the window. "No use counting supplies," she said calmly, "if the roof is washing the numbers away." Several of the men exchanged uncertain glances. The oldest council member, Samuel Briggs, slowly leaned back in his chair. "You seem to notice everything." "I notice what people stop seeing." Her answer carried no pride, only honesty. Gideon folded his arms. "So tell us." Clara walked toward the window overlooking the settlement. Children still laughed outside, chasing one another through muddy streets while farmers hurried to cover wagons before the storm arrived. "It isn't one problem," she began. "It's 20 small ones pretending not to know each other." No one interrupted. "The grain is getting wet before it's stored." She pointed toward the trading post. "The well sits too close to runoff. One heavy storm and your drinking water turns dangerous." Her eyes shifted toward the eastern pasture. "The fences aren't just broken. They're breaking where the soil is weakest." She turned toward the room. "And every family keeps preparing for this week instead of next month." Samuel rubbed his gray beard thoughtfully. "You figured all that out from one walk through town?" "I've been watching since sunrise." A younger councilman scoffed. "Watching doesn't fix anything." "No." Clara nodded. "But it tells you where to start." Before another word could be spoken, a teenage boy burst through the cabin door, soaked by the rain. "Mr. Briggs." Everyone turned. "The Miller family's grain shed." "What about it?" "The roof gave way." The council rushed outside. Sheets of rain now poured from the dark sky. By the time they reached the grain shed, half the roof had collapsed beneath years of neglected beams. Burlap sacks lay scattered across the muddy ground. Golden grain mixed with rainwater, disappearing into the dirt. Farmers scrambled desperately to drag the heavy sacks beneath wagons. Others simply stood frozen, unsure what to say first. Without raising her voice, Clara stepped into the chaos. "Leave the soaked sacks." Several men stared at her. "What? They're ruined anyway." A farmer frowned. "That's half our grain. And you'll lose the other half if you keep wasting time." She pointed toward the remaining dry sacks stacked against the back wall. "Move those first." Her confidence finally pushed everyone into motion. Within moments, nearly 20 people worked together. Women carried smaller bags. Children gathered loose tools. The strongest men lifted entire beams from the collapsed roof. Even Gideon joined them without asking a single question. An hour later the storm eased. The yard looked like a battlefield. Mud-covered boots. Broken timber lay everywhere. But nearly 2/3 of the harvest had been saved. Samuel wiped rainwater from his face. If we'd started with the wet grain. Clara nodded. You'd have lost everything. For the first time that day, no one questioned her judgment. As evening settled over Blackbriar Crossing, the townsfolk gathered inside the meeting hall. A fire crackled in the stone hearth while damp coats hung from wooden pegs near the entrance. Someone quietly placed a bowl of hot stew before Clara. She thanked them with a gentle smile. Across the room, the blacksmith who had mocked her earlier finally spoke. I judged you too quickly. You judged what you saw. I saw a traveler. You still do. He chuckled awkwardly. Maybe. Samuel stood and cleared his throat. We've spent years solving problems after they happen. His eyes settled on Clara. Perhaps it's time we started preventing them instead. Murmurs of agreement spread through the hall. But before anyone could discuss plans for the following morning, the heavy doors burst open once again. A rider stumbled inside, breathing hard. His horse stood trembling outside in the rain. They're coming, the stranger gasped. Who? The Ash Creek Riders. The cheerful mood vanished instantly. Every face hardened. Even Gideon's expression changed. Clara noticed it immediately. You know them. He answered without taking his eyes off the exhausted rider. I hoped they had forgotten this place. The rider swallowed hard before delivering the words no one wanted to hear. They'll be here. By sunrise. The rider's final words hung in the hall like the last echo of a gunshot. They'll be here. By sunrise. No one spoke. The crackling fire suddenly seemed much louder than before. Samuel Briggs slowly placed both hands on the table. How many? 15. Maybe 20, the rider replied between heavy breaths. They're camped near Dry Hollow. I rode around them after sunset. A murmur spread across the room. 20 mounted raiders were more than enough to wipe out a small settlement like Blackbriar Crossing. They've been taking livestock all across the valley, Gideon said quietly. If folks resist, they burn what's left. One of the younger ranchers slammed his fist onto the table. Then we fight. Another immediately nodded. We've got rifles. And 12 men who know how to use them. Clara remained silent. She watched every face instead. Some looked angry. Some frightened. A few were already defeated. Finally she asked a single question. When was the last time they attacked? The room grew quiet. Samuel answered. 3 days ago. And before that? Almost a week. She looked toward the rider. Did they steal food? No. Horses. Some. Cattle. Most of them. Clara lowered her eyes for a moment. They're not looking for a battle. The young rancher frowned. They're outlaws. They're hungry outlaws. No one understood what she meant. She walked to the map hanging on the wall. Her finger traced the trail leading into Blackbriar Crossing. There is only one wagon road wide enough for 20 horses. Gideon nodded. The canyon pass. If they come together, they'll have to ride through there. She turned back toward the room. How wide is it? Maybe 20 feet. And the ground? Mud after rain. A slow smile crossed Clara's face. The storm may have given us something. The blacksmith folded his arms. You're smiling. I'm thinking. She pointed toward the map again. If we try to outshoot them, we lose. No one argued. If we panic, we lose. Again, silence. So we don't give them either. Samuel leaned forward. What are you suggesting? We make them believe this town isn't worth attacking. Several eyebrows lifted. How? They're expecting fear. She looked toward Gideon. What if they find preparation instead? The room remained puzzled. Clara continued. Move every wagon into the canyon before daylight. The canyon? Leave just enough space for one rider at a time. The blacksmith finally understood. A bottleneck. She nodded. Exactly. She turned toward another group. Cover the wagons with wet hides. Samuel looked confused. For what? So fire arrows won't matter. Now the ideas began spreading through the room. Clara wasn't talking about fighting. She was talking about denying the raiders every advantage. She continued assigning work. Every family carries water barrels behind the church. Children stay in the stone cellar. No lanterns after midnight. Every animal goes into the north pasture before dawn. The room suddenly filled with movement. People no longer stood wondering what might happen. They had jobs. As the meeting ended, Gideon caught up with Clara outside. Rain had stopped. Cold clouds drifted across a moonless sky. You've done this before? No. You sound like you have. She looked toward the dark hills. My grandmother always said survival begins long before danger arrives. Gideon studied her carefully. You miss her. Every day. He gave a small nod. So do I. She looked surprised. My wife. His voice grew quieter. She always thought farther ahead than I did. He stared toward the sleeping town. I didn't realize how much until she was gone. Neither spoke for several moments. Sometimes silence carried respect better than words. Long before dawn, Blackbriar Crossing was already awake. Without shouting, without panic, the settlement moved like one determined family. The blacksmith reinforced wagon wheels with fresh iron bands. Farmers stacked empty barrels behind wooden fences. Women filled dozens of water buckets from the well. Children carried blankets into the church cellar while pretending it was another game. Even the oldest townspeople insisted on helping. Clara walked through every street quietly checking each preparation. Nothing escaped her attention. A loose gate latch. A forgotten lantern. A frightened horse tied too close to the road. Each small mistake disappeared before sunrise. As the eastern sky slowly turned gray, Gideon climbed onto the watchtower beside the old grain mill. He narrowed his eyes toward the canyon. Several minutes passed. Then he saw them. Dark shapes. Moving steadily through the morning mist. Horsemen. One after another. More kept appearing. The Ash Creek Riders had arrived. Their leader rode at the front on a massive black stallion. Unlike the others, he wore no bandana across his face. He wanted everyone to know who he was. A long scar crossed his left cheek. His coat was expensive. Too expensive for an honest man. Gideon whispered under his breath. Silas Crow. Clara climbed the tower beside him. You know him. I hoped I'd never see him again. Below them, the town stood completely still. No screams. No running. No confusion. Just quiet preparation. Silas Crow slowed his horse at the mouth of the canyon. His eyes narrowed. The wagons blocked nearly the entire passage exactly as Clara had planned. Only a narrow path remained. One rider. One horse. Nothing more. Behind the barricade stood the people of Blackbriar Crossing. Not hiding. Not charging. Simply waiting. Silas studied the settlement for a long moment. Then, to everyone's surprise, he smiled. It wasn't the smile of a man discouraged by an obstacle. It was the smile of someone who had just noticed a challenge worth accepting. He slowly removed his gloves, looked directly toward Gideon, then let his gaze settle on Clara. Even from across the canyon, she could feel it. Silas Crow tipped the brim of his hat ever so slightly. Then he spoke loudly enough for the entire settlement to hear. I wasn't expecting someone clever. He paused, his cold eyes never leaving Clara. But clever people. A faint grin spread across his face. Usually make the most interesting enemies. Silas Crow's grin lingered for only a moment before he nudged his black stallion another step forward. The hooves stopped just short of the narrow passage between the wagons. Behind him, nearly 20 mounted riders waited in silence, their horses restless beneath the cold morning wind. The people of Blackbriar Crossing held their ground. No one reached for a trigger. No one shouted. Clara stood beside Gideon at the front of the barricade, her hands resting calmly on the rough timber of a wagon. Silas studied the town with careful eyes. "I've ridden through settlements bigger than this," he called. "Most folks start begging before I even dismount." "We're not most folks," Gideon answered. "No," Silas admitted. "I can see that." His gaze drifted back to Clara. "You planned this." "I planned for trouble," she replied. "I didn't know it would wear such a fine coat." Several riders chuckled behind their leader. Silas laughed as well. "I like her." His amusement quickly disappeared. "But I still need horses, cattle, and supplies." Samuel Briggs stepped forward. "We've got families here." "So did the last settlement." A heavy silence followed. Clara noticed something the others hadn't. The raiders' horses looked exhausted. Their saddlebags hung nearly empty. Even the men carried the weary posture of travelers who had spent too many weeks chasing survival instead of fortune. She quietly leaned toward Gideon. "They're running out of food." "You sure?" "Look at their mounts." Gideon did. The ribs of several horses showed beneath dull coats. The animals lowered their heads whenever they caught the scent of hay drifting from the north pasture. Clara understood everything. Silas Crow wasn't attacking because he enjoyed violence. He was desperate enough to believe stealing was his only remaining choice. She stepped away from the barricade before anyone could stop her. "Clara!" Gideon warned. She ignored him. Stopping several yards from the wagons, she faced Silas alone. His men tightened their grip on their rifles. "So," Silas said, "the clever one walks toward danger." "No." Clara met his eyes. "I walked toward the man making a mistake." His expression hardened. "You think you've figured me out? I think Winter already has." Silas said nothing. "You can force your way into this town," Clara continued. "Some of us will die. Some of your men will die. The cattle will scatter. Half the food will be ruined in the fighting." She pointed toward the tired horses behind him. "And by the time you're finished, you'll still be hungry." Several riders lowered their eyes. They knew she wasn't lying. Silas slowly climbed down from his horse. The entire settlement tensed. Every rifle followed his movement. He stopped only a few feet from Clara. "Then tell me," he asked quietly, "what would you do?" She answered without hesitation. "I'd stop running." His jaw tightened. "You don't know anything about me." "I know enough." She nodded toward his men. "They follow you." "They do." "Then lead them somewhere worth staying." For a long moment, only the wind moved between them. Finally Gideon walked forward carrying a burlap sack. He placed it on the ground. Inside were dried beans, smoked meat, and 2 loaves of fresh bread. Samuel added another sack. Then another. Soon several families quietly stepped forward with small offerings. No one emptied their pantry, but everyone gave something. Silas stared in disbelief. "You'd feed the men who came to rob you?" Samuel answered first. "We're feeding hungry people." The old councilman smiled faintly. "What they become after that is their decision." One by one, the Ash Creek riders looked toward their leader. No one spoke. The choice belonged to him. Silas removed the pistol from his belt. Every heartbeat inside Blackbriar Crossing seemed to stop. Then, he slowly placed the weapon on the ground. The sound of cold steel touching dirt echoed through the canyon. Another rider dismounted. Then another. Within moments, nearly every weapon had been laid beside the trail. Silas looked at Clara. "I don't remember the last time someone offered me another road." "You can take this one." He extended his hand. She shook it. Not because she trusted him completely. Because everyone deserved one honest chance to choose differently. The following weeks tested that decision. Some doubted it. Others expected betrayal. Instead, the former raiders worked harder than anyone. They repaired fences damaged during the autumn storms. They rebuilt the Miller family's grain shed with stronger beams than before. The blacksmith found willing apprentices among men who had once lived by the gun. Slowly, suspicion gave way to respect. When spring finally arrived in 1818, the hills surrounding Blackbriar Crossing were greener than anyone remembered. Fresh crops pushed through rich soil. New calves wandered the pastures. The settlement no longer measured its future one season at a time. It planned years ahead. One evening, Gideon found Clara standing beside the creek where they had first met months before. The water flowed gently beneath the fading sunlight. "You were right," he said. "About what?" "The town didn't need someone to rescue it." She smiled. "It only needed someone to remind it how to prepare." Gideon handed her a small leather-bound book. She opened it carefully. Every page was blank. "What's this?" "A new ledger." She looked up. "The old one is full." Gideon nodded. "And this settlement still has many years ahead of it." Clara ran her fingers across the empty pages before closing the cover. The first ledger had recorded survival. The second would record growth. Behind them, children laughed through the streets of Blackbriar Crossing while farmers and craftsmen worked side by side, no longer divided by fear or old mistakes. Some victories on the frontier were won with rifles. The greatest ones were won with wisdom, preparation, and the courage to believe that even the hardest seasons could give way to a better tomorrow. As the evening sun settled beyond the western hills, Clara looked over the thriving settlement that had once stood on the edge of collapse. This time, she wasn't searching for what was broken. There was finally something far more satisfying to see. A community that had learned the strongest frontier wasn't built from timber, fences, or weapons. It was built by people willing to protect one another, prepare together, and choose hope over fear. And that lesson would outlive every winter that came after it.